Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. My name is Danielle Harvey and I'm the festival director. FODI started in 2009 and is the original Disruptive Ideas Festival. FODI exists to bring to light important conversations that push the boundaries of conventional thought. In modern Australia, productivity is all that matters, or so our leaders tell us. However, the way we have pursued economic growth in the last 30 years has prevented many people from sharing the rewards. We now create wealth via exclusion. Writer Denis Glover argues that an economy is not a society. We desperately need to confront the working conditions, jobs and lives we want for ourselves and our families, and to choose a future that is designed to benefit all Australians, not just some. This is the FODI 2015 session, Winners and Losers.
Think about it for a moment. What's the most dangerous and unsettling idea of them all? Dangerous and unsettling because it upsets our basic certainties and our hopes, especially the hope that things will always get better. Perhaps it's this, the idea that the past was a better place than the present, and that the present is probably better than the future. It's unsettling because it sounds so plausible. The idea that we are captive to a process of change that is as unstoppable as it is unpleasant. When I hear myself saying this, I think I must be becoming conservative. After all, it's conservatives who are against change for its own sake, or so we're led to believe. But the strange thing is, I don't feel conservative at all. Sometimes slightly nostalgic. If I show traits of being conservative, it's paradoxically because, in relation to the world, I'm becoming more radical. It's our country and our world that are really changing. We are the fixed point, not our economy, our political system, our society, or our little world. Let's start this off personally. Recently, someone I know who was about 30 said to me that her generation of friends, middle class, recent university graduates, were living in a constant stage of apprehension about the future. Perhaps their story is similar to yours. They were doing pretty dead-end jobs, volunteering for worthy organisations, applying for internship after internship, hoping desperately that someone would give them unpaid work so they could get a foot in the door of their professions. But waking every morning in a state of cold fear about where they are going to end up after all those years of study and accumulation of debt, which I found both extraordinary and extraordinarily sad. You see, my university days were the most enjoyable days of my life. Admittedly, they lasted a decade. And I'll bet that those of you over 45 here today will agree with me. I was free. My university education was free. I had scholarships, so they even paid me. I got clean, free, without debt. And I can't remember spending a single minute before graduation wondering what I would do with my life afterwards. I even chucked in my law degree to study philosophy because I hated the law and was insanely confident I could get by and do whatever I wanted to do. You know, I think if a son or daughter did that now, their parents might disinherit them. The future back then was open. It is absolutely indisputable, I think, that university life was better back then. Immeasurably better. Was it just because when I was a student, I was young, carefree, debt-free, single, free of mortgage repayments and superannuation balances and children to endlessly worry about? Or is my experience part of a universal experience? Was the past actually better? Was the past actually better? So let me try and answer a question. Was Australia a better place all round 30 to 40 years ago than it is now? And if it is, why? I want to begin to answer that question with a journey. In December 2013, I attended a children's birthday party for my older sister's granddaughter. It was at Myuna Farm, a community farm next to the neighbourhood in which I grew up in Doveton, a suburb created by the Victorian Housing Commission to house the people employed in the big factories opening up in Dandenong next door. Pictures of it then and now are on the screen. We should think of Doveton the way we think of those communities that philanthropists like the Cadbury family and William Owen and others set up for the working class in 19th century England, semi-utopian in its moral ambition. We don't think of the Housing Commission that way, but we should. With time to spare, I diverted through my old street, just for old time's sake, and what I saw upset me. To put it directly as I can, it looked like poverty to me. Now, I'd been through the area and even the street regularly, off and on since I'd left it to go to university when I was 18. My family still lives close by. But this time it felt different. My father had recently passed away and it brought back a lot of memories for me. I guess it was this emotional state that led me, as soon as I got home, to write an essay about my old neighbourhood that was originally published in The Age and then Best Australian Essays, culminating in an approach from Black Ink to turn it into a book. At the heart of that book lies a memory. You see, I'm old enough to remember when Doveton and other working class places like it were prosperous, when people who worked in factories weren't poor, when they weren't the working poor but the working class. There's a difference. People tend not to know this. They assume that, like Mount Druitt in Western Sydney, places like Doveton were always poor, always had high unemployment, were always full of people on welfare. But it's not true. And this fact is essential to understand just what has gone wrong. It's also essential to understand what is wrong about my old and beloved Labor Party. As I said, Doveton was built to house the workers in the three big factories built along the Princes Highway from the mid-1950s onwards: General Motors Holden, Heinz and International Harvester, who then built trucks. At their height in the 60s, 70s and early 80s, these three factories alone had 7,500 jobs. Doveton had 2,500 houses. That's 3 jobs for every home. And I know this because my father, my mother and my oldest sister worked in those factories, and in the university holidays, I did too. Unemployment back then hovered around 1 or 2% in Doveton. The people of Doveton were working class, but they were far from poor. Their unionised jobs gave them good wages and conditions. Their streets were pleasant. Their bright little shops were full of customers. Their children went to university even before going to university became the norm. Almost all of my close friends from my working class childhood went to university and TAFE and became professionals. Their local Labor Party branches, with their genuine members who paid their own membership dues and believed in Labor's historical mission, selected the best locals for Parliament. But today, after 30 years of glorious economic reform, the factories are all but gone. You can see some of them empty, hollowing, echoing places up here on the screen. Those 7,500 jobs have been turned into 500. 3 jobs to every home is now 1 job to every 5 homes. Doveton's unemployment rate is 21%. At the height of Paul Keating's recession we had to have, it was only 19%. Its Labor Party is bereft of ideas, its unions are broken, and as a result, those with jobs are often trapped on the minimum wage. Its streets are smashed up, as you can see. Its shopping strips are full of $2 shops and charity shops, as you can see. Its schools are mostly closed, smashed up, as you can see. And the local principal told me few of its children are likely to get to university now. In fact, that's not quite true. What he really told me is that he doubted that a single child from his school would get to university, a single child. But I didn't have the heart to write it in my book. It just seemed too bleak, too heartbreaking, almost disloyal. So it's no surprise that Doveton's Magistrates Court is full of people whose problems with drugs and alcohol and depression are related back to their inability to make it safely from school to work, from childhood to adulthood. Doveton, along with similar places like Norlane, where the unemployment rate is 20.7%, Broadmeadows Campbellfield, 25.7%, Elizabeth in South Australia, 32.6%, 32.6%. Think about that. These places are proof positive that the promise of economic reform was only meant for some. These suburbs were murdered, and our economic reformers, with their philosophy of creative destruction, are the guilty party. When you think about how much has changed in those places, and more to the point, when you see with your own eyes how much has changed. The great towering factories with their vast car parks and traffic jams at clock off and clock off time, gone. The unions with their promise of good wages and control over working hours, gone. The social capital, I hate that term. The canteens and the social clubs and the factory Christmas parties and the homegrown leaders, gone. And in some respects, the working class itself, gone. Replaced by the new creation called the non-working class. When you see those things, you understand that what has happened is something more substantial than just economic reform. Here's a change to a way of life as thorough and as crushing as that described by the historian E.P. Thompson in his great book, The Making of the English Working Class, which described what had happened to the English working classes at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So here's a dangerous observation. What happened in Australia in the 30 years between the mid-1980s and today is not economic reform. That's far too tame a term, one shorn of its vital meaning. It's an economic revolution that the little people lost, and which in many ways we all lost. And we are living in the dark shadows of that revolution still, that failed revolution. The old economic, social, political world has been swept away, and we have to confront that fact and change the way we think accordingly. The economic reformers who began all this change in the 80s and 90s led us to believe, in fact, promised would probably not be too strong a word, that greater productivity, by leading to higher economic growth, would make this result for places like Doveton unlikely. That all boats would float as the tide rose and everyone could aspire to something better. They're still saying it. Growth first, distribution second. Even they couldn't have dreamed that their high tide of economic growth would last for so long. But here it is, the year 2015. Australia rich, Doveton and other places like it poor for 30 years, a generation and a half. Why? Why has this happened? Well, a wise person might consider the possibility that the two results are linked, and that the way we have pursued economic growth has prevented many people in places like Doveton from sharing the rewards. In fact, this is the only serious explanation. The last 30 years have seen more than just a quantitative change in our economy. They have witnessed the creation of a new economy without a heart or a conscience. It comes down, I think, to this. We used to create wealth by including places like Doveton. Now we create wealth by excluding them. In the first 30 years after the Second World War, we built an economy that included all Australians in the creation and enjoyment of our prosperity. And in the second 30 years, we did the opposite. That's why the Dovetons of Australia are poor, not because their people are lazy or unworthy, or because the unions have let them down, or because of the failings of the welfare state. It's because we ripped the economy out from under them. For them, the past was better. And because we are linked to them by strong moral change, it was better for us too. So how did this happen? How did this transformation of our economy and society away from its egalitarian high tide succeed? Well, I believe it comes down to the power of an idea. A very literally revolutionary idea that has become the dominant political and economic idea of our times. The idea of economic reform. Or one should say more accurately, the story of economic reform, because a story can change the world. Just ask the people who wrote the Bible. For the last 30 years, we have been told a mesmerising national story that has reworked Australian economic, social and political history into a one-sided narrative all about economic reform. It goes like this. We entered the 70s looking for economic trouble. Our government was too big, our taxes were too high, our workforce too unionised, our trade too regulated, our society too insular and too unsophisticated. In short, we were almost criminally complacent, stuck in the ideas of federation, more like a communist bloc economy than a market economy, thoroughly deserving of the reckoning that was about to come to us. Then, just as time was running out, and it's always running out in these sorts of stories, we were rescued by a class of heroic policymakers, men of courage and genius who hardened their hearts against the cries of the losers from change and began an era of reform that removed the economic protections, sold public assets, slashed tax rates, abolished wage fixing, discovered Asia, made us competitive again and set us up for 23 years of uninterrupted economic growth, at the end of which we think we have the right to tell the rest of the world how it's done. There was no other way, supposedly, than their way. And now, despite the fact that we were told it had all succeeded so well, they're telling us we need to turn around and do it again. More reform, more economic reform. But is this really an accurate portrayal of what happened? Because at the time, this pre-reform economic past didn't seem all that bad. In fact, to lots of Australians, it seemed very successful indeed, delivering many things whose passing we now frequently lament. Full employment, job security, high rates of home ownership, and a far less stressed lifestyle. You know, recently I stumbled upon a glossy international magazine from April 1973 that a friend rescued from the junk pile in her parents' garage. It's called Australia, the Awakening Giant, and it shows an Australia that is modern, liberal, full of life, full of potential, the envy of the world, with great manufacturing industries and a genius for modern invention. So here is Australia, its editorial says, a land quite like any other. It is a country well worth getting to know, not only because of its intrinsic fascination, but also because it deserves to be recognised as a nation with a tremendous future. Australia, April 1973, when things were meant to be so bad. That magazine is a time capsule containing a kernel of truth about our past that the economic reform boosters at the Australian and the Australian Financial Review haven't yet been able to destroy. Like that piece of coral embedded in glass that Winston Smith finds in Mr. Charrington's junk shop in George Orwell's novel 1984. The reform boosters have rewritten the past to suit their cause, writing out all the success. Orwell, of course, could explain why this was necessary. He recognised that those seeking to overthrow the way we live always start by falsifying the past, because it's only by discrediting the good things about the past that they can make their alternative seem necessary, better, inevitable. This is the meaning of the famous party slogan that I'm sure you all know. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. By misrepresenting and discrediting the time before the heroic era of economic reform, by portraying it as complacent and corrupt and embarrassing and poor, our present narrators are clearing away the positive human memories that might restrain their attempts to create a future that is safe for their relentless task of raising productivity. This economic reform narrative has another dimension that George Orwell may have recognised. It has recast our vocabulary, limiting our capacity to legitimately conceptualise an alternative future. Like Orwell's fictional language of newspeak, it has made black into white and channelled our thoughts into ever-narrowing directions. Having inherited the economic reformers' revolution, the managerial class has bureaucratised it into a series of slogans that thorough analysis renders meaningless and contradictory, but which have taken a firm grip on our thought processes. Take the term economic reform. Note the word reform, right? In its original political and economic meaning, reform had a far richer and in some ways opposite meaning, limiting the working day, making mines and factories safer, preventing child labour, legalising trade union membership and so on. Such reforms were motivated by moral concerns, whereas today's reforms aim to remove moral concerns from economic policy almost completely and let the free market be just that, free of moral constraint, free to be a 7-Eleven economy with kids working for $5 an hour on one side and billionaires living in $25 million mansions on the other. Take also the term creative destruction, which is as clear an example of Orwell's concept of doublethink as you could get. It's often a nonsense. Sometimes the destruction of industries and businesses is not followed by the creation of new ones. Just ask the people of Doveton. And take economic reform's crowning concept, productivity. After 30 years of repetition, we have trained ourselves to regard this as the ultimate test of public policy. Nothing can be allowed to stand in its way. If it isn't everything, so our fellow guest here today, Paul Krugman, says, it's almost everything. And yet, as most economists will admit, it is difficult to define, and because it is a ratio of variables, it can lead to perverse conclusions. For example, if unemployment falls and economic output falls, productivity can go up as long as the fall in employment is greater than the fall in output. Think about that. We can be poorer and more productive. As far as the concept of productivity is concerned, the people of Doveton make Australia more productive now that they're on the dole than when they produce cars and trucks and food. Think about that. This sort of narrativising is relentless, utterly, utterly relentless. You can't open the Australian or the Financial Review on any day of the week without reading it. You know, I'm reminded when reading those papers of the joke people in offices tell about the bingo they play when the consultants from McKinsey and Bain and Boston turn up with their PowerPoint decks and their buzzwords. You know them, don't you? Cost-benefit analysis, bingo. New paradigm, it's a good one, bingo. Cost restructuring, bingo. Eliminate the silos, bingo. Well, take this, floating the dollar, bingo. Privatising the Commonwealth Bank, bingo. Abolition of trade restrictions, bingo. Rent seekers, Luddites, small government, bingo, bingo, bingo. For our economic policy reform boosters, life is just one great big game of bingo. In fact, I picked up the Australian last Saturday just to test if my bingo theory of economic reform holds true. And these were the headlines from Judith Sloan. Productivity is the key to wage rises, bingo. Paul Kelly, nation's choice, sink or swim, bingo. Chris Kenny, Labor's left, no friend of the worker. You know, as if Chris Kenny is their friend. Bingo. The editorial, and here's a good one. Labor must listen to its elders. Bingo, right? I think that editorial title, Labor must listen to its elders, quite unwittingly reveals something. This supposedly new era of economic reform that last week's Economic Reform Summit, hosted by the AFR and the Australian, tried to sell, isn't about the future at all. It's about the past, the early days of the revolution, the time when things started to go wrong. Since my book was published, the Australian has used its bingo-laden editorials to accuse me of nostalgia. But ask yourself, who are the real nostalgists peddling a fake, misrepresented past? Who is trying to recreate the past of the 1980s and 1990s, if not the economic reform boosters themselves? The world has moved on. Today's 18-year-olds were born in 1997 and were just 2 years old when the GST was created and the reform era supposedly ended. New ideas are needed. We're told by these same people with another bingo slogan that our democracy is in crisis, that reform is no longer possible, that governments that try to change things are bound to lose power, and that this is so because our leaders won't stand up to the populist tide with a promise to relive the 80s and 90s. I dispute this strongly. If change nowadays is hard, it isn't because our people are averse to any form of change. Hell, we've changed more than anyone in this country in the last 30 years. It's because they don't want the sort of change the economic reform boosters are pressing upon us against our will. The majority of the Australian people have never fully bought into the exaggerated Hawke, Keating, Howard Costello hero narrative, and they never ever will. After 30 years of economic reform, They have had enough because they know that the drive for more economic reform and greater productivity inevitably means a harder life for them. Paul Kelly's so-called failure of Australian democracy to reform is in fact the triumph of Australian democracy, people power. So Judith, Paul, Chris, Stutch, don't you get it? The people don't want what you're selling, full stop. It's called democracy, that's what it's called. So what then is the way forward for us? There will always be economic change, we know that, and economic reform. We can't stand still, we accept that. But here are two questions that embarrassing places like Doveton raise. Economic reform for what? Economic reform for whom? Yes, Australia and its economy had to change over the last 30 years and will have to change again. The world would have forced change upon us if we'd tried to resist. But contrary to what the economists have been telling us, we had a choice. There was and is an alternative. We could have changed differently. We didn't have to leave entire communities behind. We didn't have to let our manufacturing industries be destroyed and leave their people to rot. We could have stayed more equal. We could have done more and we didn't, and because we didn't, we stand condemned. It happened because we got lost in data, because we got seduced by an inhuman set of theories that forgot that jobs and GDP and productivity and welfare reform and all other types of so-called economic reform are ultimately about human beings. Because we forgot how to think morally and outsourced our moral decisions to economists whose only message was that we should harden our hearts. Because we narrowed our thought processes to what could be read on PowerPoint slides and Windows spreadsheets. Because the Labor Party started thinking of itself as a policy unit of the Department of Treasury instead of as a social democratic party with the objective of creating a social democratic country. That's how it happened. Now, I'm prepared to acknowledge that I don't have a 10-point plan for creating a better country. But I feel I need to leave you with something, some sort of answer. I think it comes down to changing the way we think about the interrelationships between economics and politics and society in a very fundamental way. You see, the way we do economics is letting us down. We've forgotten that economics started out as a moral science, not a mathematical one. Thomas Piketty says something like this in the early parts of his famous book. And shorn of its moral dimensions, economics loses its moral force and becomes yet another problem for our democracy. Authoritarian in its ambitions, theocratic in its logic, paralysing in its psychology, heartless in its practice, wrong in its predictions, inhuman in its effect, and hated by ordinary people. To really give Australians, and in places like Doveton and elsewhere, greater prosperity, we have to give them back what we took away. An economy that was willing, when necessary, to shield the little people from the full winds of the market in the name of a better and fairer society, rather than exposing them to the full hurricane, as we are now doing. But more fundamentally still, if we're to give new life to places like Doveton, we must first change the way we think. We need to lift our minds beyond the narrowing philosophy of economic reform, with its enervating cult of managerialism and its monomaniacal pursuit of productivity. We need to think wider and deeper and see things in moral terms once again. And for this we need inspiration. So where does that inspiration come from? The past, of course. To me, it comes from the Romantic movement. Those of you who read it will notice something slightly unusual in my book, or at least unusual for a Labor Party speechwriter. I quote the Romantic poets and writers. Wordsworth, Shelley, his friend Horace Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft. Why? You see, like us, the Romantic poets were a post-revolutionary generation. The French Revolution promised them the liberating freedom and equality of the Enlightenment. But they came to see very quickly that the bureaucratic class who had seized power in the name of enlightenment had little time for human beings and human feelings. The likes of Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, Tom Paine and others had been replaced by a class of ruthless, bloodthirsty Jacobins to whom human values meant nothing. Vibrant revolutionaries became dull, inhuman bureaucrats. In Russia, they became the nomenklatura. The people became an abstraction, a theoretical concept, an agglomeration of popular will. The idea of enlightenment as being all about human happiness was soon lost, and in response, the Romantics hearkened back to the past. Their pastoral verse and paintings sought out the reverence of nature, beauty and happiness, and human sociability. Beauty is truth, they said, and truth is beauty. They searched their own lives for the remnants of the Enlightenment, which they realised lay not in the realm of abstract reason, but in the realm of the imagination, which Mary Wollstonecraft memorably summed up as the true fire stolen from heaven that leads to the sociability of mankind. Today, the big promises made to us by the economic reformers have been crushed. The philosophers of economic freedom have been replaced by dull managerialists. And instead of obtaining new freedoms, we've been turned into data and KPIs and been given productivity increases and debt, and in places like Doveton, 21% intergenerational unemployment. Just as they did for the Romantics after the French Revolution, the answers for us, the generation that lives on after the neoliberal revolution, lie in the past, in the way our parents' and grandparents' generation organised our society. We have, in effect, to become the new Romantics. And that once great political party that should be leading the fight back, the Labor Party, has to rediscover its romantic convictions too. To find that inspiration again, we need to reach back and try and recapture the imagination that once led us to try to create a country ruled by the idea of decency, which gave people in places like Doveton things almost impossible to conceive of today: affluence, success, happiness, even a job. We need ultimately to begin our economic thinking from a new place, from the idea that our economy should include everyone in the creation and enjoyment of our wealth, not just some people. Ladies and gentlemen, if the past was better than the present, the starting point for creating a better future lies in your memories and in your romantic instincts. Only they can defeat the dull minds who now try and tell us how to live our lives. Thank you.
The Festival of Dangerous Ideas is presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of our life. We offer counselling for individuals, leadership and development services, events, courses and educational resources. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations and memberships. Please visit the Ethics Centre website to find out more. Thank you.